Good morning, everyone. Having a good time so far? Anyone tired after the first day? Yeah, I know my feet are killing me. Okay, so welcome to the first session. Thank you for getting up this early to see this. It will be Sysadmin Guide to the Cloud, so we will discuss how sysadmins should transition to the cloud. Any sysadmins in the room? Okay, nice. Any developers? Okay, good. Okay, so let me introduce myself quickly. My name is Mustafa Taraman. I come from Bosnia and Herzegovina. I work as a lead system engineer and program architect for a company called Authority Partners. I've been Microsoft Azure MVP for last 4 years. I'm also very certified in Microsoft technologies, over 50 certificates right now, and so on and so on. So how many of you actually use Azure right now? Okay, that's nice. How many of you are still on-prem but considering? Okay, that's also good. That's nice. So first, let's discuss how we manage Azure. So there are multiple tools that can help us do that and achieve that. And we have, based on our preferences, option to use Azure Portal, to use Cloud Shell. This is actually a shell in the web browser. We have Azure PowerShell and Azure CLI. So how many of you use Azure Portal right now? A lot of hands. What are the other two, any out of the shells? PowerShell, CLI, and Cloud Shell, okay. That's also a nice number. So what we need to understand first is how Azure Resource Manager is structured. It's something introduced along the way. It wasn't always there when we talk about Azure. We had a standard model first that was quite different and was really hard to manage and give permissions. And Azure Resource Manager, when it was introduced, allowed us a lot of flexibility on that. So we had management groups or tenant at the top level. Then beneath that, we had the subscriptions, beneath the subscription resource groups, beneath the resource group resources that allowed us to granularly apply access and control. It gave us more options. Did anyone use Azure before the Azure Resource Manager was introduced? A couple of hands, okay. So back then, you didn't have option. So for example, if I want one of my admins to only access resource group, nowadays I can grant them access to that only to that resource group. Or even go below that and say, okay, not even the resource group, I want you to manage this virtual machine or this storage and so on. Back in the day with the standard model, basically what you had was an option to allow a person to be co-admin on your subscription. And that was basically it. Nothing granularly. If someone needed access to a virtual machine, you had to give access to complete subscription. So that was really hard to manage. Luckily, with Azure Resource Manager, a lot of things changed, and it gave us a lot of flexibility on that part, and we can manage access much, much, much easier now. Now, when you open Azure for the first time, you can kind of get overwhelmed because we have hundreds of services right now. It's also like in the past, expertise in IT was kind of granular as well. For example, I remember the times when in the IT Pro track, MVPs would be either for Hyper-V or for cluster or storage and Active Directory and so on. Nowadays, I'm an Azure MVP. So when I discuss things with people, they assume I know everything in Azure. That's simply not possible. That's never going to happen. There are services in Azure that I never touched. For example, my colleague yesterday gave a session on cognitive services that I first watched. I didn't know. I knew it existed, but never knew anything about it. So it can be overwhelming. So try taking one step at a time. Don't rush into it. If you're considering moving to Azure, start learning slowly, adjust your learning curve, and take one service at a time. How many times did you see this slide so far? Is there anyone in the room that didn't see this slide? Few hands, okay. So basically, in Azure, or any cloud for that matter, we have multiple things, multiple models, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service that are kind of different from private cloud and how we manage things in our own environment. And if you look at this, it kind of may look that we're losing part of the control. But it can be beneficial. It can take part of the workload from us and allow us to do some other things that it's not necessary to do it ourselves anymore. Okay, so if you're transiting from on-prem environment, if you're an IT pro in on-prem environment, easiest way is to start with the infrastructure as a service, basically virtual machines. And some things are kind of different. We don't anymore handle networking. We don't handle storage. We don't handle virtualization layer. What we pick up is basically we select what kind of operating system we want. We select what kind of configuration for our virtual machine we want, and so on. With the platform as a service, we lose a little bit more control. So it's even more part of the abstract layer, and we'll see that in how different it is to run one thing and another. So when starting with infrastructure as a service, it's very important to start with virtual networks properly, because in the long run, it can come and haunt you down the road. It can, if you make simple mistakes in the beginning, it can complicate your life a little bit later. Why? Because, for example, when you're creating your first resources in Azure, and for example, you can create a virtual machine, and in the process of creating a virtual machine, you will be offered to create a new virtual network. And you might not consider that part very important at the time, but once again later, when you go down the road and have like 100 or 1,000 of those virtual machines in there, it can start to get complicated, and it can be hard to get back on the track and fix things easier. So let's look on how that looks like with the virtual networks. Okay, perfect. So let's create a new virtual network quickly. So we'll call the resource Ignite. We define the address space that we want for our virtual network. Now, that part is kind of important because you need to consider what you're going to do with this virtual network in the long run. Are you going to enable some hyper connections? Are you going to connect it to via express route or site-to-site to your environment? Because you need to consider these address spaces not to overlap with other networks that you want this to be connected to. So you need to consider what kind of address space you actually want to use. So in the long run, when you plan for hybrid cloud or you want to connect to other virtual networks, those virtual networks, basically, these address spaces cannot overlap. So I'll leave it by default now because it doesn't really matter to me. We select. Okay, also one thing that is actually new, we have IPv6 address space added quite recently. And this option is now, so by default, you have IPv4 IP addresses, but from recently, you can add IPv6 if you want. Okay, we select subscription. We'll create a new research group called Ignite. We select location. Okay, location is a very important thing because of network latency. So If you choose to use Azure, you have plenty of regions available right now, many data centers. It's ideal to use data center or region that's geographically closest to you because you're going to have lowest network latency to that data center. So if your services are running there, only naturally it's much easier. For example, we are in Florida right now, so it's much easier to use East-US and not, for example, Australia data center that is basically half across the world, and logically it would create much bigger network latency and your services would respond much slower to your requests. So in this case, let's use West Central. Next, we need to name our first subnet. By default, it's named default. And you can change this later, but I like to set this up and say, for example, call this front end. We define the IP address range for the first one. By default, it takes /24 subnets, allowing 256 addresses. Actually, that's not true. 5 of the IP addresses always fall off from your IP address range. So you don't get all the IP addresses. You always get 5 cut that are used by Azure in the background. You have option for DDoS protection. This was kind of always here, and the basic tier was always present, but we didn't see it until standard tier was introduced that we actually need to pay extra for. So if DDoS protection is needed as an extra layer, you can add it. We have option for service endpoints that will allow us to add platform as a service services as well to our virtual network to allow them to communicate on the private network, not exchanging information over the public network. And we have option to add firewall if one is present. If you have a firewall already enabled, you can add it right here. So we'll create first one. We'll create virtual network, and that's it. So basically, it doesn't take very long time to create one, only usually under the minute, but we'll switch to that a bit later. Next step is, as I said, consider if you want to run hybrid cloud. There are multiple options available, site-to-site connection, express route. Also, in terms of communication between your virtual networks in Azure, if you have different virtual networks, there's option for VNet peering or VNet to VNet connections that will allow virtual machines and other services connected to that virtual network across networks to communicate as well. Next step after we create a virtual network is to start with the virtual machines. So what we need to decide location for our VM. Our virtual machines need to be in the same region as our virtual network. Again, consider because of the network latency, the closest data centers and closest regions. We need to determine size of the virtual machine, how much of the resources we're going to use, and this is going to affect price very much. More CPU and more RAM, it will affect the price. The higher we go, the more expensive the virtual machine will be. We need to understand how the pricing model works. Aside from the compute hours, so when you look at the price, when you're starting to create a virtual machine, you see the compute hours, so how much CPU and RAM for that virtual machine is going to cost you. But there are additional costs you need to consider as well. So, for example, you extra pay for the storage. So storage and the disks that you create for that virtual machine are another story. They are not included in the original price, so you need to consider that as well. Also, what you need to consider, the compute hours are paid only when the virtual machine is running. So if you stop the virtual machine, you're not paying for the compute hours. But if the machine is stopped, you're still paying for the storage you're paying for the disks. So you need to consider that as well. Another thing that is not shown in the price is bandwidth, because network coming out of the Azure is charged. So anything that you put in Azure Data Center is completely free of charge. The data you download from there is charged extra. There's I think 5 gigabytes per subscription that are free. After that, you pay. It's not a big amount of money. You need to accumulate terabytes of downloads to actually affect your bill, but it's also important to consider down the road. Consider what kind of storage you want to use. We have multiple options for the disks. We have options for standard, premium, and premium SSD disks. Again, the better tier of the disk, the more you will pay for them. There are also options for the managed disks nowadays. I highly recommend you do those. If you don't use managed disks, you need to manage storage for the disk yourself. You need to consider IOPS capacities and different things. If you use managed disks, these things are done automatically for you, and you don't need to consider those. There are multiple options for operating system besides usual Windows servers. We have many, many Linux options. It's maybe interesting to say today that around 50% of workloads in Azure are between Windows and Linux, so it's kind of an even game right now. That's kind of strange when we consider how different things were just a few years back, when we had a different CEO at head of the Microsoft. Things were running very, very differently. So it's kind of funny how far we come and how open Microsoft became to the open source community. Okay, so as I said, we need to consider a few things. Managed disks. We also need to consider availability sets, update and fault domains, availability zones. There's option for scale sets and network security groups. I've already mentioned managed disks, so my big recommendation is go with them. Don't try to manage the storage on your own, because you will hit multiple limits in the capacity. You have to think about these when you're expanding disks, how many disks you can handle in the single storage, when you need to create a new storage for new disks, etc. Using managed disks that does all that in the background for you, and you don't need to think about it. Also very important to consider availability sets, update and fault domains, availability zones. I'm putting them in one group because they are kind of connected. Just by putting our virtual machine in Azure, it's not enough to say it's going to be up 100% of the time. We need to consider additional things. So putting more virtual machines and setting them in availability sets ensures a higher SLA, and that those virtual machines will be running, have better chance of running all the time than when we have a single one. Availability sets ensure that these virtual machines will not fail in case of single rack failure inside the Azure Data Center. So when we put two virtual machines in availability sets, they will be definitely running on different set of hardware. So if one rack fails, the other virtual machine will still be running. Update and fault domains ensure that when maintenance is run, your virtual machine is actually your virtual machines in the same set are across those zones, so they will never be patched and updated at the same time. So at least one of them will be running from that perspective at all times. And availability zones introduce additional things. So when we create a virtual machine, we only see a region, and each region has multiple data centers in the background. And all those data centers have separate buildings inside, many of those buildings. And basically, each building inside the Azure Data Center has its own independency. It has its own networking, own power supplies, backup generators, and so on. So putting virtual machines in different availability zones ensures that if one of the data center buildings fails, you have virtual machines running in a different zone, and it will be still running when that happens. Okay, so we also have scale sets. that allow us to create multiple instances of the single virtual machine at a time. So basically allow us scaling up and downs. If we have for example, web server that has increases and decreases in the workload through the day, we can set up scale option rules and create more or less instances based on the workload. The bad thing about it is that it supports only static context, so virtual machines that don't change very often. It's good for the app servers or for the web servers or that sort of roles, but anything that has a constant state change, for example, databases, scale set is off the table. You cannot use that. Also, when creating virtual machines, you get to create a network security group. Network security groups are basically sort of first level firewall that you have that enables you to create rules what can pass and what cannot inside your virtual network. Network security groups can be created to be attached at NIC level, so attached directly to the virtual machine, or on the subnet level. I would recommend going with the approach with network security groups being attached on the subnet level, because in the long run, if you have too many of those network security groups, and I'm saying when we have more than 10, 20, or 50 virtual machines, it's going to be hard to manage what those network security groups are and how we handle them. So if we have a network security group that blocks everything, and we have a new virtual machine that needs to communicate with that virtual machine, we need to set rules that will allow communication between them on both network security group levels, on both virtual machines. So my recommendation for the approach would be to use network security group at the subnet level and place virtual machines that should communicate with each other on the same subnet. That will allow you more flexibility, and it will be easier to manage those network security rules down the road. Okay, so let's see for the virtual machines what we have. Let's quickly create one. Let's go with Windows Server, the first option. It's easiest. So we have Ignite created. Oh, sorry, excuse me. Thank you very much. Okay. So we are creating, let's go back one step. I didn't go very far. So we are going to create a virtual machine based on Windows Server 2016. First option is to give general information. I'm going to use same network, same resource group as earlier. We're going to use Ignite. Let's call the virtual machine Ignite as well. Not Ignite. Okay. Which region did I use? West. Okay, let's. Okay, thank you very much for reminding me of that. Now we come to the part of availability options. Now it's very important to say that we need to add availability set right here, right now. You cannot change the availability set of the virtual machine after you create it. So now I have an option to create a new availability set. We'll add one. We'll say, let's call it Ignite as well. So we'll call everything Ignite. You have an option to set fault and update remains right here to change them. They're directly connected to availability set. Again, very important, if you don't say which availability set is off the table. Once you create a virtual machine, it's done, you cannot change that. You may change a lot of things down the road, but this is it. If needed, we can change image for the virtual machine right here. We select size. We have many, many sizes right now. I remember the times when we had like 10 or 15 of them. There are multiple options right now. I'm just going to pick like the first one. It's for the demo, so I don't really care. I'm not going to do anything with this virtual machine again. What we need to consider for the administrator account, we have to provide a username. So things like admin are not allowed. Admin, root, sysadmin, SA, or all those kind of usual default credentials for the admin are off the table. They are not allowed to be used. There's a very good reason for that. So if I just tried, there's another thing that we'll discuss while creating this virtual machine. So I spinned up 4 virtual machines. I left RDP port open to be accessed over the internet and just left those virtual machines monitored. And I was checking out what's going to happen to them. So in less than a week, on each of those virtual machines, I had 40,000 hits by brute force attacks. Just leaving RDP open. Those were like nothing special about those virtual machines. They were not targeted. They were like just created empty, totally empty virtual machines, but left with the public access RDP. And I just left it and monitor what happens. So you have an Azure Security Center that kind of collects those logs and you can analyze and see what happens. So out of those, 40,000 attacks on each of the virtual machines, so it's 160,000 attacks. And out of those 160,000 attempts, over the 95% were admin, root, and those sort of credentials. So by default, Microsoft doesn't allow you to use that because it's gonna hit you. It's easier to get brute force hacked if not. In the past, there was also an option where you couldn't use most common names. For example, John was of the most common names for also because they're often used in brute force as well. Luckily for me, Mustafa is not a very common name, and I can use it whenever I want. For the password, we need to provide, so it's like the usual 3 out of 4, we have to have at least 12 characters and capital letters, uppercase, lowercase, special character, and the number. So 3 out of 4 of those and at least 12 characters. So let's provide something. Okay, and now we get to the part where we define what kind of public access we want. So RDP is by the default allowed, but I would recommend to avoid that. So much better options to managing those virtual machines when they are created is either to use site-to-site, point-to-site, any kind of connection, but try avoid using RDP access. There is an option to overcome this, but we'll come to that in a few minutes. So let's switch to, we'll leave RDP for now open. There's option for the hybrid benefit model where you can transit your Windows licenses and pay less for the virtual machines as well if needed. There's option for the disks. As I said, try using managed disks. There are multiple options, so we have standard HDD, standard SSD, and premium SSD. It's pretty clear which is the best. So just keep in mind that bigger price also means better performance means bigger price as well. So keep that in mind. Okay, so we'll switch to networking now. Because I set up virtual machine in the same region where my previous virtual network was created, it automatically picks Ignite as a virtual network. If not, if I select a different zone, if I did select a different region, now it would probably offer me a different one if I had one virtual network in that region, or it would offer me to create a brand new one. We'll just leave those things at basics. There are multiple networking options, but we'll just leave the basic options. Also very important, consider boot diagnostics, OS gas diagnostics. You can provide diagnostic storage account where all those logs will be kept. I recommend enabling all of them because it will help you in the long run. You have option to assign managed identity if needed, to use your Azure AD, so on. Auto shutdown options to enable when this virtual machine should be turned off. So if you're using this virtual machine only as in single part of the day, for example, you're using it 9 to 5, after 5 p.m. no one is going to use it. You can set up shutdown to save some money if needed. And also option to enable backup. Now, only because we're running virtual machines in Azure doesn't mean that we don't have to have backup anymore. Backup is still important. We have an option for Azure Site Recovery that can help us back up our virtual machines to have even backup or even DR site. It will take too much time to set this up, so I will just skip it. And we can add tags for easier management, review and create, and I will create this virtual machine. Okay, so while the virtual machine is creating, it will take a few minutes. Let's get back to this. We need to consider platform as a service as well. So infrastructure as a service is nice. It's a really familiar environment. Doesn't really, there's not much difference between running virtual machines on Hyper-V and running them in Azure, except we don't control hypervisor anymore. Maybe to mention that even Azure is running a special hardened version of the Hyper-V, in fact, so everything we see in there, everything in Azure is running on Hyper-V. So platform as a service is still based on virtualization, but we have a more abstract on traditional services. We don't have so much control for the virtual machines. We still control everything from the operating system up. We select operating system, we spin up virtual machine, and we can control what kind of roles, what kind of software is going to run on them. With the platform as a service model, we have a little less control, and we don't have those options anymore. We don't see many things that are already that we use to handle ourselves. Easiest way is to actually start using Azure Web Apps and Azure SQL databases as a platform as a service model, first step into that direction. Azure Web Apps are basically an abstract on the IIS server, so you get a service where you can just deploy your web apps. You don't have options to control anything underneath. You don't have application pools anymore, and so on. So let's quickly look on how that looks like. Okay, I need to switch. Virtual machine is still running, so let's spin up one of the web apps I already have. So I have an app service somewhere. So let's take, for example, look at my blog. This is basically one web app. And you have some options to control. It's basically IIS. If I run here, it will open a website. But what we need to consider is that we still have some certain options. So we have certain configuration options that will allow us to say, for example, we can say what kind of connection strings we have. In the general settings, we can change the .NET version, .NET framework which we want to use. Is it going to be 32 or 64-bit platform, managed pipeline, FTP if it's allowed or not, HTTP version, WebSockets, always on, and so on. So there are some certain options that we control, but it's kind of different from classical IIS because we don't control everything. Maybe we can see also here. Give me just one sec. So if I open App Service Editor, we can see the folders in there that are created for us. It's taking a bit longer. So if you look at here, what we have is basically www root. So it's the same folder that we would have when running any kind of web server. We have a folder where we can put in our code. We have some kind of configuration of options, but most of the things is off the limits, and we don't have so much control anymore. We don't have so many options to play with as we used to. Okay, let's move on. What else do we need to consider? We still need to consider high availability. Again, just by putting things in Azure doesn't guarantee high SLA. We need still to consider how we design our infrastructure. For the virtual machines, we have options for the load balancers. Those can be internal load balancers that play only with internal IPs, depending on the service you use, or they can be Azure load balancers that offer access over the public IP addresses and enable high availability for your services. So setting up a load balancer and more virtual machines spread across availability sets and availability zones will give you better options, so you can basically ensure higher availability of your service. There are also different things that can play with platform as a service model, Azure Traffic Manager or Application Gateway that are kind of Azure Traffic Manager is basically a reverse proxy that enables you to add different endpoints that will be accessed over one, basically load balancing again. Application Gateway is a layer 7 load balancer. We can enable a web application firewall for more protection. That will also give us more security for the service. It's nice to know that, for example, web application firewall can protect you for certain application vulnerabilities that you missed. For example, it can detect and stop SQL injection attacks and that sort of thing. So even if you have vulnerability in your code, in your application code, it can detect certain vulnerabilities and stop them on the web application firewall level and not allow those kind of accesses. I mentioned it while creating virtual machine. We still need backup and DR. There's options for recovery service vault. It's used actually for both Azure Backup and Azure Disaster Recovery. Try enabling those options. Backup will give us option to restore the virtual machine if needed. DR can be even set up to automatically fail over with certain automation scripts and things, so we can basically have full DR options and even automated. We also need to consider what happens to identity. Very important step. We use Azure AD for identity in Azure. Is there anyone not using Azure Active Directory here? Oh, no one. That's good. Very often mistake is that people forget that they might have Azure Active Directory in the first place. So for a lot of companies, first step to the cloud was moving to Office 365. And when they started with the, Office 365, they had created Azure Active Directory by default. And they even synced their identities from on-prem. They kind of forget about it. When they start using Azure AD, they create a new tenant. They start doing everything all over again. And they have two Azure Active Directories trying to use same identities. And then the mess up is created. It's really hard to fix everything. So when considering moving to Azure, it's very important to consider if you're using Office 365, if you have Azure Tenant and Azure Active Directory already. As mentioned, we have option to sync with the local Active Directory to move our identities. If you do so, try enabling single sign-on options for users to use same credentials with password hash syncing. Very important, use MFA for at least admin accounts. When we move our identity to the cloud, to the Azure Active Directory, we expose it publicly. It was much different when using local Active Directory, because if anyone wanted to use our credentials, they had to have access to our network and so on. With cloud, it's much harder. So try using MFA at least for the admin roles, at least, but try enabling it for all users as well. Also consider privileged identity management. Is anyone using PIM right now? Okay, I'm glad to see a few hands in the air. What privileged identity management allows you is basically, even if you have a certain admin roles, just by signing into your account, you don't have them. You have to go to the different portal and say, okay, for example, I'm an Exchange admin. I'm going to work on Exchange today. I need to go to the portal, activate my role for a certain period of time. And once that period expires, I'm no longer Exchange admin. I need to go to the portal again and activate it. So even if credentials leak, someone managed to steal your credential, just by signing in, they don't have all the access you actually have. They still need to, you need to activate those roles for them to be really, really active. Also, very important to try to work with the infrastructure as a code. That's like for the sysadmins, system engineers, and anyone else for starting to work with the cloud. Try considering infrastructure as a code. We have multiple options, Azure PowerShell and Azure CLI by default options. We have also RM templates today that developers find easier to handle, but we are catching up on that as well. We have desired state configuration for virtual machine configuration, so we can install roles while deploying the virtual machines as well. We have many other tools like Ansible, Terraform that can be used in similar fashion. Also, if you're going down the road of infrastructure as a code, try using repositories for both infrastructure as a code and other scripts. It doesn't have to be exclusive for infrastructure as a code. If you have a maintenance scripts for rebooting services, gathering some kind of information, basically everything that we code, everything that we write should be in the repository. It helps you track changes, to collaborate with your team members, to exchange scripts. Someone can fix, you might have problems with your script. Someone will go there, access the script, fix it for you, and so on. Okay, do we have any questions? Yes?
What repository are you talking about?
Basically, there are multiple options. So by the default, I would say there's Azure DevOps. That's a Microsoft product. It's free for 5 team members. You don't have to pay any kind of licenses. Five team members can work with it free of charge. There's also Git and so on. So many, many other options. Yes, please.
You mentioned MFA for admins.
Okay.
How do you solve automation, schedule scripts, schedule tasks?
Okay, I would go with, so if you have scheduled scripts and that sort of, I would go with managed entities and try to using application registrations and use service principals instead of credentials. Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of different from the classical service principle that we had. It's called app registration in Azure Active Directory. No problem. Anyone else? Yes, please.
Subnet naming, Bastion host, it's got to be a certain name.
Yeah, there's some.
Is there an authoritative list of the reserved names? Because I also remember some people like
Yeah, there are multiple, not only Bastion. There's for Azure Firewall, for example. There are certain services, and they will require, when you try to create them, they will ask for certain subnet, or they will create it for you. So. Okay.
There were a number of things that you had just said before and couldn't go back. Is this one of them? Can you change the type of disk later on?
Depending on the disk. For the data disk, you can change them at any time. For the OS disks, you need to redeploy virtual machine actually to Sysadmin. Okay. Thank you very much.